The final aspect of the user story that we want to cover is being able to list each of the order items as the field service technician is creating the order items. We want to see for the entire order also what the subtotal and the number of items in this order so far. All right. So as a result, the focus is going to be on that that items property that we added in the previous lesson. I think this is going to be pretty easy. All that's really left to do is to add up or to create a number of order items and make sure that their quantities and their line totals match these properties that we added in the previous lesson as well for the order item count and the subtotal. All right, and we could probably test an exceptional case here as well, ensuring that nothing blows up when there are no items in either the this items property, the order items private property there, or whenever we're using any of these properties. But the first order of business is really to go back to our order test and to refactor out some of this setup work, because we're going to need it in a new unit test that we'll create to test this scenario where we're listing out each of the items. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to strip out a lot of the work that I did in the arrange portion of this unit test, the add order item, valid order item, adds order item unit test, and put it either here in the initialize or put it here at the very top of the class. All right, so let me go ahead and just start working through some of that. For example, let's grab this and get it out of there, and instead we'll do something similar to it here. And we'll go ahead and do the same thing for an order as well. And so let's do the same thing for a contract here. Now again, just because I'm doing it this way doesn't mean that I am still happy with, hard coding all of these things like I talked about in the previous lesson. It's just, at this point, we're just going to work with what we've got and then worry about refactoring a little bit later once we've got this spike working. Let's grab the part and put that, kind of treat it the same way like we did here. So private part. All right, so all that's really left here in the old unit test that we created in the previous lesson is just a small arrange where we're creating an order item. We are calling the add order item and the act and the asserts stay the same, and I just got to make sure that we're now working with the correct values there. Great. Okay. So next up, what we're going to do is go ahead and create the unit test, which is really at the heart of this particular lesson. There's two things that are going to be different about this new unit test. I'm going to be testing properties, not methods. I want to make sure that I can do what I need to do with the order.items property that we added in the previous lesson, and that I can do with it what I need to in the future, and that any changes will not affect it in the future. So remember that the items property is read-only, and that it's of type I read-only list order item right here, okay? And so, meaning that it'll have many of the features of the list of T without the ability to add or remove items from it, okay? And then secondly, the second thing that is different about this unit test is that I don't anticipate that this will force me to add any new code. I'm not completely sure as I set out. I think I have everything that I need to properly test the items property like I want to in this new unit test. So I don't anticipate this driving the design of any new functionality, any new properties or methods, okay? So I ponder how best to test this items property. I decide that what I'm going to do is I'm going to add, like I've done here, a couple of these order items to an order, and then I want to iterate through them and check the items and the properties of the items. So admittedly, I feel a bit paranoid to do it this way. However, I'm not sure how else to test the functionality to ensure that it will work correctly for my user story than to actually go through and check to make sure that everything kind of adds up. So here's what I'm going to do. So here what I want to do is just copy this and paste it in 3 times. Call this order item 1, 2, and 3. And so the only difference here is in the number of the quantity and how that affects the line total. Okay. And then what I'll need to do here is okay, so I'm adding 3 order items to our order, and this is the hard part. And this is what I'm trying to decide how best to do. I'm testing the fact that we can iterate over items and that we'll be able to do everything we need to do with it in the future. So here's what I'm going to try to do. So for each item in our order items, what I'm going to do is just make sure that each has what I would expect it to have. So each item is, for example, a type of order item. And I'm not really sure how else to do this for each item then, to just check and make sure that the properties are all the correct type and that their values are in the correct range. So that's what I'm going to set out to do. Whoops, that's not what I meant. That's what I wanted. And here, because I don't know exactly which item I'm testing, I can't test for the actual, part or price rather. But I can ensure that it is greater than 0. Here again, I don't know which one I'm working, which of the order items I'm currently iterating through, but I can ensure that the quantity is greater than 0. And that the line totals are greater than 0. All right. And then at the very end, what I can do is test the order itself. So I want to see how many items I have. And I can do the math in my head. If you were to add up the totals for each of these 3 order items, I know that total would be should be greater than 300. All right, so whoops, that's not quite right. It should be 300 equal, not greater than. All right, and then assert R equal the order item count, And that should be 6 items. Again, I can just tally up the quantities from all 3 of these order items, and that should result in 6. All right, so there we go. So a lot of coding in the unit test, and it doesn't seem like anything new was needed in the production code. The real test, of course, is will it work? And it seems like it did. Okay, very good. So the final case, the one that I described at the very beginning of this lesson, is to ensure that we can reference the items property prior to adding any items. I don't anticipate needing to do that. I would consider that really an edge case, but bugs find their way into our code around the boundaries, around the edges. And so testing an aggregate with 0 items seems like a good measure of caution to exercise here. So in my mind, this is a simplified version of the previous unit test. And so let me go ahead and create this as well. Start out with test method, obviously, and public void. Now I gotta give this a name. So I want to make sure that I'm testing items and containing no orders will not throw an exception. All right, so in this case, there's really nothing to do. I don't need to add any order items. The point of this is to not add any order items. So there's no arrange other than what happens in the initialize here. Okay, so that's good. So then what I need to do is just iterate through, and this code should never execute. So if there's any code in this code block that does execute, then we've got a problem. Therefore, I'm going to call this assert fail. And I'm just going to type in here, there should never be any items in the items collection. All right. And then let's assert.arEqual. And here I just want to make sure that each of these properties, like the count, is 0. Okay. And so we want to ensure that items, or the order item private property of the order class, is instantiated in the constructor. That's what this will help us ascertain. All right, and also let's assert arEqual the subtotal. It should be default to $0 and cents, and then assert arEqual the order item count should also be 0, because again we haven't added any items to the order. All right. So the key idea here is this assert.fail, and what we want it to do is that if there are any items ever in the future by default added to an order without us calling the add order item, then we want to be able to check that and say it failed. All right. Again, this might be a little over paranoid, but the reason is that I'm not familiar with this I read only list that we added here, because it's kind of new. And so since it's a new feature in the .NET framework and I've not become familiar with it as I'd like, I need to build some hedges around it and really come to understand what it does for me. If nothing else, this gives me confidence to better understand it going forward. All right. So let's go ahead and run the unit tests. And you can see, whoops. All right, so if we take a look at the where the problem lies, it says that it's happening in the initialize. It threw an exception that the contract is expired. And I think what's going on here is that because of the way that we define this, we really can't do it quite this way. What we're going to need to do is like this, because it's time sensitive. So what happens is it runs once at construction, and then from that point on, it will just use that date time, but the date time is in the past, a second later. So we can't rely on that because of the timing issue. So that means right before every single test, what we need to do is go contract equals new contract. There we go. That's a little bit more like it. I'm betting that this will fix it. Let's see what happens. Okay, and let's run it a couple of times just to make sure that our timing issue is fixed. Okay, very good. Okay, so I'm relatively satisfied with what we've got so far. Admittedly, I've only created about 11 unit tests. However, this was a very small and a pretty easy user story to tackle, and we're only focusing on the domain layer. Our architectural spike is going pretty well, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I'm not claiming it's perfect or anything like that, and I've intentionally stopped here even though we haven't talked about some pretty important things like saving the order and order items into our persistence layer. I want to discuss our options there in a little bit more depth, so I decided to hold off until we talk about architecting the persistence layer in another series. In addition to that, we might discover that we've forgotten something else in our domain layer or the unit tests, and so there might be a chance that we need to revisit our work here in another series as we continue to work on our architectural spike. But again, we're not finished, not claiming to be finished. We'll pick it back up in the next series. So to recap, the point of this series was to employ those ideas that we talked about in the Application Architecture Fundamentals series. I laid out a scenario, and we used that to analyze the requirements, identify candidate architectures and classes for our domain layer. Then I decided to build an architectural spike, and I chose to allow the domain and the unit tests to guide the design of the software. Along the way, hopefully you saw the thought process. It wasn't pretty. You saw the angst that went into it and the mistakes that I made. But we learned and we used Microsoft's unit test framework in Visual Studio. And we even used some new C# keywords and concepts as well. Again, it wasn't always smooth sailing. There was a lot of angst and second guessing and some regret and some struggle and some messiness and some disorganization at times. But in the end, I'm satisfied, or at least I'm satisfied enough for now with what we've accomplished in a relatively short period of time. So there's plenty more to work on, and we'll pick it back up in the next series. We'll see you there. Thank you.